Why is it that in an age where information is everywhere, true critical thinking seems to be vanishing? Carl Jung once warned that a society drowning in information without wisdom would not become enlightened, it would become enslaved. He argued that when people lose the ability to think independently, they regress into collective conformity, where stupidity is not just tolerated, but celebrated. Imagine standing in a marketplace where thousands of voices scream for your attention. Some are selling truth, some are selling lies, most are selling noise. At first, you believe you can separate them. You think, I will know what is true, what is false. But slowly, the sheer volume drowns you. You stop questioning. You accept what is repeated the loudest. And one day, you no longer know whether the words in your mind are yours or someone else's. Jung warned, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. We see this now everywhere. On social media, where a single simplistic phrase gets more traction than a well-reasoned argument. In politics, where outrage replaces evidence. In daily life, where people repeat slogans and memes as if they are profound wisdom, never realizing they are parroting someone else's manipulation. This is the death of critical thinking, not with violence, but with noise, not with censorship, but with distraction. Jung believed the human psyche craves simplicity because true thought is painful. To question everything, to examine the shadow in oneself and in society, demands courage. Most people choose comfort over truth. They follow the herd because it feels safe, even when the herd marches toward the cliff. And the terrifying reality is this: stupidity doesn't just survive in such an environment, it rules. Because it is easier to be entertained than to be awakened. The irony is brutal. We have more education than ever, yet less wisdom. We have more facts, yet less truth. People read headlines, but not history. They echo sound bites, but not substance. Jung foresaw this when he said modern man would face an unprecedented danger. Not ignorance of knowledge, but an inability to integrate knowledge into meaning. Without integration, knowledge becomes fragments, and fragments become weapons of confusion. Consider the consequences. A society that cannot think critically cannot tell the difference between propaganda and truth, between freedom and manipulation, between growth and regression. It becomes vulnerable to mass hysteria, to movements fueled not by reason, but by emotion. Jung's study of the collective unconscious revealed how easily crowds descend into irrationality, and how quickly rational individuals dissolve into collective stupidity when they abandon their own inner judgment. And here lies the tragedy. When stupidity rules, it does not look like stupidity. It looks like certainty. It looks like confidence. It looks like popularity. The people who ask questions are mocked as cynical, negative, or even dangerous. The people who repeat slogans are praised as wise, patriotic, or enlightened. The inversion is complete. Thinking becomes deviant. Conformity becomes virtue. This is why critical thinking is dying. Not because people are incapable of it, but because society rewards the opposite. The man who doubts, the woman who questions, the child who asks why again and again, they threaten the comfort of the collective, and comfort always seeks to silence disruption. Jung warned us, the greatest danger is not the man who knows nothing, but the man who believes he knows everything because he has stopped asking questions. The question now is, are we awake enough to resist this tide? Or will we too surrender our minds to the collective and call it wisdom? Carl Jung believed that the erosion of critical thinking begins not in governments or institutions, but inside the individual psyche. When a person neglects their inner life, their doubts, their questions, their shadows, they slowly hand over their judgment to external forces. The danger, Jung warned, is that what we refuse to confront within ourselves returns from the outside in distorted, destructive forms. And so, in a society that fears self-reflection, stupidity doesn't just appear, it dominates. Look at the way people consume media today. A single headline designed to spark outrage or delight replaces investigation. A viral post becomes more convincing than years of research. People share, comment, and argue, but rarely stop to ask the most essential question: is this true? Jung observed that when people give up that question, they surrender their sovereignty. They no longer think, they are being thought. This is not accidental. Jung warned that mass culture always pushes toward the lowest common denominator. Complex ideas are uncomfortable. They require patience, silence, discipline, but entertainment is addictive. Stupidity is contagious. It spreads like fire through the collective psyche because it promises instant belonging. You don't need to think, just agree. You don't need to question, just repeat. And slowly, people lose the strength to resist. The terrifying part is that most do not even notice the transition. They believe they are informed because they are surrounded by information. They believe they are wise because they echo the loudest voices. But wisdom is not repetition. It is integration. Jung insisted that true thought comes only when the conscious mind wrestles with unconscious impulses. Without that inner wrestling, a person may appear clever, but inside they remain passive, asleep. History shows us the consequences of this surrender. Whole societies have collapsed into tyranny, not because people were ignorant, but because they refused to question. They chose the comfort of collective slogans over the pain of individual judgment. Jung studied these movements in his own time, the mass hysteria of early 20th century Europe, and he warned that they were not relics of the past. They were psychological patterns, and therefore eternal. We see the same patterns now: tribalism online, political fanaticism, pop culture obsessions. The collective sweeps people into its current, and the individual self begins to dissolve. The language changes, the technology evolves, but the underlying psychology remains the same. Stupidity thrives wherever conformity is rewarded, and conformity is always rewarded where people fear exclusion more than they value truth. And here's Jung's chilling insight. Stupidity doesn't simply rule by silencing thought. It rules by making thought unnecessary. Why struggle to reason when a meme provides the answer? Why wrestle with contradictions when an influencer tells you what to believe? Why hold complexity when the crowd chants in unison? The death of critical thinking is rarely a dramatic collapse. It is a slow erosion, a quiet surrender, a giving away of one's most precious capacity, the ability to discern. The tragedy, Jung insisted, is that every individual carries within them the potential for truth. Each person has an inner compass, a spark of consciousness capable of piercing illusion. But when that spark is never tended, when it is drowned in entertainment, when it is buried beneath conformity, it dies. And when enough sparks die, society enters darkness. The warning could not be clearer. Stupidity is not just a cultural problem. It is a psychological epidemic. And like any epidemic, it begins one person at a time. With every moment we choose comfort over truth, distraction over reflection, conformity over courage. Jung often described the psyche as a battlefield, where forces of light and shadow struggle for dominance. Critical thinking belongs to the light. It demands awareness, discernment, and courage. Stupidity belongs to the shadow. not because people are born foolish, but because they allow unconscious drives to overtake them. When a society abandons critical thinking, what really happens is that the shadow of the collective is unleashed. Think about the last time you heard a crowd chanting in unison. At first, it feels powerful, even intoxicating. The energy pulls you in. You feel a sense of belonging. But beneath that unity lies something darker, the loss of individuality. Jung warned that when the individual dissolves into the crowd, moral responsibility vanishes. People do things together that they would never do alone. And stupidity, magnified by numbers, becomes not just ignorance but destruction. This is why critical thinking is more than an intellectual exercise. It is a moral duty. To think critically is to resist the temptation of the mob. It is to stand, sometimes trembling, against the tide of easy answers and popular delusions. Jung saw this resistance as one of the rarest forms of courage, because it requires going against not just external forces, but one's own unconscious desire for safety in numbers. Modern life makes this battle even harder. Algorithms feed us what we want to hear. They whisper, "You are right, you are wise, everyone else thinks as you do." This creates an illusion of thinking, when in fact, it is only confirmation. People scroll endlessly, mistaking constant stimulation for knowledge. Jung would call this the psyche's regression into infantilism, an addiction to comfort, a refusal to face the discomfort of reality. But here's the paradox. Stupidity rules not because it is powerful, but because it is easy. To think critically is exhausting. It requires silence in a world of noise. It requires skepticism in a culture of blind optimism. It requires humility in an age of arrogance. No wonder people resist it. They would rather be certain and wrong than uncertain and searching. And so stupidity becomes not just common, but triumphant. Jung believed the greatest danger was not that individuals would lose their intelligence, but that they would lose their individuality. A clever person can be manipulated. A thinker who abandons their inner voice becomes possessed. Possessed not by demons, but by collective archetypes. Those vast, unconscious patterns that sweep through societies like storms. In such possession, people defend their stupidity with ferocity because they believe it is truth. We see it in the way people cling to false narratives, even when evidence proves otherwise. To abandon the illusion would mean facing the pain of being wrong, and most people would rather protect their ego than face reality. Jung would call this the triumph of shadow over self, the refusal to integrate truth because the lie feels safer. And so the decay spreads. Schools reward memorization over questioning. News cycles reward speed over accuracy. Public debates reward performance over substance. Slowly, the very structures that should nourish thought begin to suffocate it. Stupidity becomes systemic, woven into the very fabric of culture. Yet Jung also insisted that the individual still has a choice. The psyche cannot be forced into awakening, but it can be invited. The decision to think, to question, to resist, begins with one moment: the refusal to surrender. If even a few individuals keep their light alive, they can ignite sparks in others. And though stupidity may rule, it does not have to reign forever. Carl Jung taught that every collapse of thought begins with an inner collapse of courage. Critical thinking dies not because people lose their intelligence, but because they abandon their responsibility to use it. To think deeply is dangerous. It threatens authority, disrupts comfort, and exposes illusions. This is why stupidity often rises to power. It promises safety, simplicity, and belonging, while truth demands solitude, struggle, and sacrifice. Consider how society conditions people from a young age. Children are taught answers, not questions. They are rewarded for repeating, not for doubting. By the time they become adults, most have been trained to follow systems rather than challenge them. Jung observed that the unconscious of such individuals becomes ripe for possession by collective forces. They are intelligent enough to function, but not awake enough to resist. And so they become obedient participants in their own deception. This obedience is not neutral. It is dangerous. Jung warned that when masses of people surrender critical thought, society becomes vulnerable to manipulation. History's darkest chapters were not written by monsters alone, but by ordinary people who failed to question. They followed orders, repeated slogans, and believed lies because thinking was too painful. In such moments, stupidity does not merely rule, it destroys. In our time, this destruction takes subtler forms. Instead of burning books, algorithms bury them. Instead of silencing voices, distractions drown them. Instead of dictatorship through fear, we face dictatorship through comfort. People willingly give up their independence for the illusion of connection, the illusion of certainty. Jung would say they are living under a psychic spell, a hypnosis of the collective unconscious, where the need to belong outweighs the need to be true. And what becomes of the individual who tries to resist? Often, they are ridiculed. They are labeled negative, elitist, or paranoid. The collective always protects itself by attacking dissent. Jung called this a projection of the shadow. People accuse others of the very blindness they refuse to see in themselves. Thus, the thinker becomes the scapegoat, while the herd calls their ignorance wisdom. But there is also hope in this dynamic. Jung believed that every scapegoat holds the seed of transformation. The individual who resists stupidity, even in isolation, begins to carry a light that others unconsciously recognize. Though mocked, they plant questions in the minds of those around them. And sometimes, a single question can be more dangerous to stupidity than 1,000 slogans. This is why Jung saw critical thinking as not merely an intellectual act, but a spiritual one. It is the confrontation with darkness, both within and without. It is the refusal to betray one's inner truth for the comfort of conformity. It is a rebellion not of violence, but of consciousness. And in a world where stupidity rules, such consciousness is the most radical act possible. So the real question Jung leaves us with is this: how many of us are willing to endure the loneliness of thought? How many are willing to lose the approval of the herd to keep their integrity? For the fate of society does not rest in the hands of the majority, but in the courage of the minority who still dare to think. Jung's final warning was stark. If critical thinking dies, civilization follows. Stupidity may rule for a season, but its rule always ends in collapse. A society built on illusions cannot endure, because reality will always return. The question is not whether stupidity will fail, but how much suffering it will cause before truth is rediscovered. In the heart of every individual lies the seed of resistance. Critical thinking is not a gift for the few. It is a duty for all. It begins not with grand gestures, but with small acts. Pausing before you share a lie. Asking whether your belief comes from evidence or comfort. Daring to question even when the answer threatens your ego. Jung believed these small acts of integrity, multiplied across lives, could hold back even the strongest tides of collective delusion. But make no mistake, the battle is internal before it is external. Each of us carries both clarity and stupidity within. Our unconscious longs for simplicity, for certainty, for escape from responsibility. Our consciousness calls us to discernment, to humility, to the painful work of truth. To keep thinking is to wage a daily war against our own laziness, our own fear, our own shadow. Jung knew that if we fail in this war, the collective shadow will rise and rule us instead. The future then depends not on technology, not on governments, not on slogans, but on the courage of individuals willing to remain awake. For stupidity can dominate only when people surrender their awareness. The moment one person dares to see clearly, stupidity loses its spell. The moment one voice speaks truth, the silence of fear begins to break. So when Jung warned that stupidity rules, he was not condemning humanity. He was challenging it. He was telling us that our survival depends on something as simple and as difficult as the refusal to stop thinking. In an age where distraction is constant, this refusal becomes revolutionary. To think critically is to rebel. To remain conscious is to resist. To integrate truth, no matter how painful, is to keep the light of civilization alive. And perhaps this is Jung's most haunting message. Stupidity may always return, but so can wisdom. Each generation faces the same choice. Each individual holds the same power. The day we allow critical thinking to die is the day we choose darkness. But the day we protect it, even in the smallest ways, is the day we ensure that truth, though battered, will never be destroyed.